Welcome back to Grade 8 History, Unit Number 2, Canada's Changing Society, 1890 to 1914. This is lesson number 23. How did First Nations respond to assimilation? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. Do you know any of the methods which the federal government used to assimilate the First Nations peoples in the late 1800s and early 1900s? What do you think the First Nations could do to prevent assimilation? I'd like you to put this video on pause so that you can consider these two questions. And if you have any ideas, write them down in response to these two questions. And then when you're ready, hit play. All right, let's begin. As we learned earlier, in the late 1800s, the federal government carried out policies to assimilate First Nations peoples as part of the Indian Act. These policies included forcing First Nations to live on reserves, establishing residential schools, and banning traditional ceremonies. In BC, only a small part of the province was set aside for First Nations reserves. The reserve lands were now close to growing cities or were rich in natural resources. Sir Richard McBride, the Premier of BC, wanted to take control of the reserve lands so that there would be more areas for settlement and development. And just take a look at this photo here from 1900. This photo shows Songhee paddlers competing in a canoe race in Victoria, BC in 1900. And now, based on the number of teams and spectators, how popular do you think this event was? Please put the video on pause so you can take a closer look at this photo, write down your response to this question, and then we'll continue. And let's move forward. McBride's BC government had tried to persuade the Songhee tribe to leave their land in exchange for small cash payments. When the Songhees refused the offer, the government tried to take away the Songhees' First Nations status and make them Canadian citizens. This meant that the Songhees' reserve land would no longer be protected. The land would be divided among the Songhees' families and owned separately by each family. And I'll just direct your attention to this cartoon on the left. Why do you think the cartoonist uses a car to depict the city of Victoria's progress? Again, put the video on pause so you can take a closer look at this picture. Write down your response to this question in blue, and then we'll continue. And moving forward. Songhee chief Michael Cooper actively negotiated an appropriate deal with McBride's government. Each of the 43 Songhee families would receive a large cash settlement in exchange for giving up the reserve lands. The Songhees would relocate to a new reserve chosen by McBride and 5 Songhee members. The government would pay for all of the moving costs and would guarantee land, fishing, and hunting rights for the Songhees. The Songhees kept their First Nations status. After the negotiations, Cooper spoke of McBride's generosity and even named McBride an honorary Songhees chief. And just looking at this photo on the left, this photograph shows McBride and Chief Cooper attending the ceremony in which the Songhees transferred their land to the BC government. Residential schools were perhaps the most brutal way that the federal government tried to assimilate First Nations peoples. John A. Macdonald's government worked with various Christian churches to create the first residential schools for First Nations children. One of the key strategies of the residential school system was to remove First Nations children from their families and make them live at the school. I just want you to take a close look at this picture here. My question is, why do you think the Department of Indian Affairs would want this photo of Pewich and his children to be taken? So I want you to put the video on pause and just consider how differently Pewich is dressed from his children. So take the time to write down your thoughts on this photograph and then we'll continue. Let's go forward. First Nations parents did resist the government's efforts to take their children, in addition to policies that were enforced in the schools. Some parents were able to get school officials to agree not to baptize their children without their parents' consent. Some schools did allow family visits after protests from parents. Sadly, many of the residential schools did not respect or cooperate with First Nations families. And take a look at this photo on the left. My question to you is, how does this photo show First Nations resistance of their children attending residential schools? So put the video on pause so you can take a closer look and just take a look at the residential school as well as the camp set up by First Nations peoples here and how close it is to the school. So write down your response to this question in blue and then we'll continue. Now let's move on. The conditions within the schools were horrible. Some students were stripped of their birth names and were given English names, or in some cases just numbers. Teachers were abusive and punished students who spoke their native language. Students were made to feel ashamed of their culture to the point that when they did go home, they could no longer speak the language or practice their parents' culture. Many died in the schools due to a lack of food, physical abuse, illness, or suicide. The last residential school closed in 1996, but the damage caused by these schools still has an impact on former students and their families today. In 2008, the federal government finally made a formal apology to former residential school students. From 2008 to 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada gathered evidence in order to prepare a report that would educate Canadians about what happened in these schools. The Commission continues to work to build more respectful relationships between Native and non-Native communities. In 1884, the federal government passed a law forbidding potlatch, a gift-giving ceremony practiced by many First Nations peoples on the Pacific Coast. The goal of the potlatch was to strengthen relationships between First Nations communities. The federal government saw the potlatch as reckless and wasteful. From 1884 to 1951, potlatches were banned under the Indian Act. Anyone holding a potlatch would be jailed for months, and sometimes sacred and ceremonial objects were taken away. Just take a look at this beautiful painting here on the left. According to this painting, what was involved in greeting guests to a potlatch? Please put the video on pause so you can take a longer look at this picture and then write down your response to my question in blue. Alright, getting near the end, let's continue. Many First Nations communities resisted the ban by holding secret potlatches. The Haida held potlatches disguised as Christmas, Easter, or other European holidays. Their insistence on holding on to their traditions even won support from some Christian missionaries. After the ban was lifted, many First Nations communities continued to hold potlatches, although on a much smaller scale. And Thankfully, as you can see from this photograph, potlatches continue to be held throughout Canada today. All right, so one final question to close out this lesson. What do you think was the most important act of resistance by First Nations during this time period? And why do you feel this way? So just put this video on pause one last time so you can consider this question, write down your response. If you don't feel prepared to answer this question, means that you should go back and watch this video at least one more time, and then when you're ready, please put the video on pause. And as always, I look forward to hearing your responses to this and the other questions included on this video. But until we meet again, this does conclude today's video.